You're listening to Future Artefacts FM, a bi-monthly podcast and broadcast featuring speculative fiction audio works by artists and writers, produced and presented by Nina Davies,
Rebecca Edwards,
and Niamh Schmidtke on RTM,
and also available wherever you get your podcasts.
The programme focuses on fictional works intended for broadcast to carve out a better understanding of the now by exploring various interpretations of the future.
Together with guests, we discuss the mechanics of different types of storytelling to reveal the complexities of contemporary culture. Let's get started.
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 This miniseries is commissioned by Henry Moore Institute to accompany their exhibition Phantasmagoria, Folkloric Sculpture for the Digital Age, open 15th May 2026 to 30th of August 2026.
For more information, just visit the Henry Moore Institute website.
Welcome back to Future Artefacts FM, episode 38, and also the last episode of our mini-series Phantasmagoria, Folkloric Sculpture for the Digital Age, which we've produced in collaboration with the Henry Moore Institute, which is part of the online program for the exhibition, which is running until August 30th. And with us in the studio today, we have Bassam Issah Al-Sabah. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
You come all the way down from Dublin,
Yes.
just to be with us, which is like the first time that we've actually had someone make a specific trip to be on the show, which is like a big win.
International international trip. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here, Bassam.
Thank you for
It's
having
really
me.
nice to have you in person.
Yeah, so today you're going to be sharing a new work called Image Field, which you've made in collaboration with Jennifer Mehigan.
Yeah, so to introduce Bassam and also his collaborator, Jennifer. So Bassam Issah Al-Sabah is a visual artist working across film, animation, sculpture and installation. His practice explores digital and material forms, shifting identities and the circulation of emotion in contemporary culture. Notable solo exhibitions include The Mission is the End is All I Want, Fact Liverpool, and Uncensored Lilac at Transmediale in Berlin, and It's Dangerous to Go Alone, Take This at the Douglas Hyde Gallery in Dublin in 2022. Al-Sabah has shown internationally at venues like the Barbican Centre, Jeu de Paume, and Liaf Biennial. He has received prestigious awards, including the Prix Ars Electronica Award of Distinction in 2023 and the Golden Fleece Award in 2021. Jennifer Mehigan's prints and paintings fuse diverse media and sources, including 3D scans of her garden, images of plants growing on the graves of strange Irish women, the archive of the Victorian portrait photographer Lady Clementia Hawarden, four-dimensional drawings by the Cork-born mathematician Alicia Boole, and an encrusted Renaissance codex known as the Voynich manuscript. Using paint, inkjet, graphics, cards, neural networks, pearl powder, and gel, her works blend new and old methods of making and processing the world, a relationship the artist views as a strained mother-daughter bond. Mehigan's wider practice also incorporates CGI, sculpture, perfumery, writing, parties, artificial intelligence, and horticulture, deploying sensory experience to explore queerness and femininity. And today we have Bassam in the studio with us, but we're also very happy to have Jennifer's contribution to this work as well.
You've been working with Jennifer for quite a while. Like your collaborative work spans like a few different works, isn't it?
We met through a mutual friend, Alyssa, when we moved to Belfast at the same time.
Okay.
There was a moment where we both had known of each other peripherally for a while. I'd known of Jennifer through like her Tumblr.
Okay.
like really way back when,
Oh,
because she had a few works that went really viral on Tumblr.
And so you didn't know her before?
No.
You didn't know her before.
And even she has like a weird like digital footprint that spans like quite some time, which is kind of interesting. But like I think we became really good friends, and then we tested out making work together slowly. So like we'd make some small things together. It's almost like you're testing if you can be really good friends but terrible collaborators, and you can be really good collaborators but terrible friends. So I think we started making really small stuff together and slowly built. And like the last thing we did that was really big was Uncensored Lilac in Transmediale.
Okay.
I think now it's been a thing where like we'll both do stuff solo for a while and we'll come back to a collaboration. And I think there's something really nice about like you get to hide behind each other. You get to be autobiographical and nobody knows where it came from.
Yeah.
And like sometimes me and Jennifer like joke that we have like an AI prompt relationship between us. Like I'll be like, I have an idea for a scene and she'll write it. She'll have an idea for an image, I'll make it. Like we have this, there's like a way you can be like half a person in that collaboration. You don't have to make every decision by yourself. And that feels really pleasant.
One of our previous mini-series was about collaborative kind of practice. And we were talking about like the sort of safety in numbers of like this is sort of our version of that. Like Future Artefacts is our version where you can kind of feel like you can tackle more when you're a group or when you're not on your own.
Yeah, and I think one of the things me and Jennifer always talk about is like the context in which our work is read. Like I'm brown, she's a woman. When we make work solo, it is read through very specific context. But when we make work together, it's kind of complicated. So if you have like Uncensored Lilac had a lot of these like representations of like hypersexualized figures of women, but then it was complicated by the fact that I was there as well. It wasn't just Jennifer making it.
Right.
So there's almost like you get to kind of give the work so much breathing space because it's not coming from one identity. We're kind of like always talking about how much of yourself do you want to give out in the work, because I think that's a really difficult one when it's almost like it feels like demanded upon you to be like a PR story. Like, you know, a very like linear story of like...
It's like your identity is as significant to the work as the work itself.
Yeah. Or
and you have to explain it
because I remember,
in the context.
Or like I remember making a work when I was just out of college and it was like a recreation of our old house in Iraq. And I just remember like everybody could only read it through the context of like migration. And people were like crying and I was like, oh, I kind of like...
That's not what it was for you. Yeah.
It's more than that.
Yeah.
You know,
or like there's more layers to it than it's like so easy to take just that context and just run with it. But when you're two people coming from such drastically different backgrounds, like Jennifer grew up in Singapore, she makes paintings, very beautiful paintings, but very like paintings. I'm making CGI films, and then we kind of come into these spaces together. The work becomes complicated by that inheritance of both of us. And I think the work we make together is also complicated by the fact that we both come from different contexts. That it's not just our own ideas. Like you have to keep someone else in mind.
Okay, so we're going to listen to the work now. It's called Image Field and it's 15 minutes long. We'll see you soon.
One, the poisonous bite. They paved the lane last summer so the servers could arrive without mud on their tires. The hedges were cut back, squared off, but I prefer boundaries that draw blood, snag wool, skin and correct on contact. The countryside now loads like an image. It's tiled, cached, surveilled, and you can only walk on it along the paths that result. Here the foxglove still stands, not so much ornament, but a rendering error the system cannot smooth. Bell-shaped, purple, a throat designed for selective entry. Farmers call it dead man's bells, but naming is just another form of containment. I was raised in these ditches, and the ditch keeps its own inventory of runoff, slurry, and coolant leaking from the cubes droning beyond the hill, low and continuous, like a second weather system. The foxglove sways, and I trace the hedgerow's edge with my tongue, tasting its hostility. The lane curves slightly, as if following a body too large to see from ground level. Containment provokes retaliation. I could bite, I could vanish, I could withdraw. I choose all three in no order, stepping further down the lane. 2. The raised tail. The line widens into a yard. Gravel has replaced mud. The donkey turns before it kicks, offering a clear diagram of consequence. Above us, the scorpion arches, though from here the body reveals itself backwards. Tail first, warning before form. This latitude only permits fragments. The donkey thorn clings to your trousers as you pass, a low-resolution alert. The farm is crowded with misclassified objects, warnings mistaken for decoration. An archive of cues indexed too quickly, flattened into aesthetic. Before the kick lands, I slip through the gate and out of the frame. 3. Mother. Soft ground now, the path dissolves into bog. The bog cotton drifts like haunted breath over the black water, marking the places where the land is soft. Call me mother if you want a mouth to kneel before it. Call me saint if you require marble to press your forehead against. Call me glitch if you need to blame the tremor on something mechanical. None of these names are binding. Milkweed splits its pods and releases silken parachutes into the air. They should not survive the winter. They do, out of spite. Survival dressed as excess. They approach me for milk or maybe absolution. Same mouth, different hunger, and I offer delay. Care is rerouted, no longer soft. A way of feeding what should not survive the winter, of keeping dead systems in circulation just long enough to destabilize the next one. Endings enter through me and leave unfinished. The bog releases me slowly. 4. Horse. Through the gate, metal against palm, interface is always intimate. Metal learns the body slowly, bit by bit, dissolving into saliva, becoming language through repetition. Bristle moss spreads across stone like a soft protocol, turning structure into substrate, architecture into host. I have known the weight of instruction on my tongue. When she bolts, it renders a line through the field so clean it becomes infrastructure, a path others will follow until it becomes law. The bristle moss spreads unnoticed underfoot. Containment, you see, is scalable, from stract to system, from system to belief. But only when the pressure of containment finds its own release, when roots split the pavement, the horse can finally run free. The horse reins, the line is drawn. The shape only becomes legible from above. I follow it out of the field. 5. Eyes. The path narrows, grass rises and begins to interfere with visibility. I reduce myself accordingly. I remain in the narrow band between recognition and discard, sub-threshold, partially legible, never fully resolved. Eyebright blooms in the damp grass, white points of corrected intent. A cure for blindness or a restructuring of what counts as sight. 2 points of brightness hold in the field without collapsing into a single meaning. The eyebright does not blink. It watches, bright and unyielding, while the ghost orchid, pale as a held breath, waits in the shadows, its petals half open, half concealed. One offers sight, the other withholds it. Between them, I move on. 6. Mother of Sorrows. The path rises toward the chapel, and beside it the data center. The rowan tree stands between them, red berries bright against grey stone, a ward against nothing. Low on the southern horizon, a red wound pulses through haze and cloud. Rival heat, improper for this climate. This is how I cradle what collapses. Calves born too early, drives corrupted by heat. The ragged robin bleeds pink at the roadside. Closure is not supported in this environment. Grief underpins everything, the chapel and the data center alike. You see, the chapel and the data center share the same architecture, containment of excess, management of overflow, the illusion of processing what cannot be processed, both failing in different registers. They carve me in marble to freeze the flood, but salt keeps rising. The rowan's branches creak in the wind, its berries falling unnoticed. I tend to the afflicted without curing them, offering consolation as compression. In the grotto, damp beads on plaster like tears that never fall. The ragged robin sways, its petals torn by the rain. Sorrow is a commons we inherit like a reservoir behind ornamental gates. I don't remove grief, I compress it, make it portable, transferable across bodies, across systems. The ruin's roots twist deeper, things collect here. I empty it when I can, but it fills again. I leave the chapel behind, a vibration follows. 7. Mother of Pearl. The path opens and the surface begins to distort. Distance becomes a processing layer. Pearlwort renders softness at a distance like stars blurred through moisture and atmospheric drag. A field of white points, like pixels resolving into coherence the further you step back. Resolution is positional. The sea holly readies its spines to prick your fingers as you reach. Go ahead, touch it. Your skin will betray you first, a bead of red on opal milk. The image does not need to be transparent to be radiant. The pearlwort shimmers in the sunlight, a false promise of softness. The sea holly does not yield, and neither do I. The system learns through corruption. I walk on before it can stabilize the frame. 8. Our Lady of Consolation. Morning damp gathers along the path. Kneel if you must, but understand this is not a solution, only a cool hand on a fevered algorithm. Lady's mantle cups the dew in its velvet leaves. Feverfew crowds the ditch, white flowers bright against the wet. A slowing of breath before the next demand. Consolation rearranges the room without changing its walls. You brush past the lady's mantle and the leaves tremble closed. Underfoot, crushed feverfew releases its bitter scent. Not the cure, only a brief softening. Beyond the hedges, the systems continue, heat moving through hidden chambers, processes feeding themselves forward. The world remains unresolved. 9. Consoler of the afflicted. The wind shifts, the path bends back on itself. Redemption, as you think of it, is too linear for the terrain we share. Consider the spirals. They are more honest about the shape of grief and the ways we return to it. The yarrow thickens blood, its white flowers a balm for wounds. The monkshood grows nearby, blue and absolute. Poison and cure held in the same structure, depending on dosage, timing, and proximity. Neither settles the other. They coexist without synthesis. The wind carries the scent of both, a reminder that healing and harm are never far apart. Nothing is cleanly isolatable in this air. I stroll between. 10. Consolatrix. Evening begins to gather, and the sweetness is adhesive. I hold the space. Wait here just a little longer. The honeysuckle's embrace is neither cruel nor kind, it just tightens according to its own logic of orbit and return. It draws you close, then releases you. The meadowsweet stays as the wind picks up. The honeysuckle's tendrils tighten, pulling you closer, then letting go. Stay a while, then leave when you can stand again. 11. The heart of the scorpion. Cold returns as the path dips. The heart of the scorpion is a server rack, overheating in February, a southern heat trapped too far north. The scorpion grass arches in the field, its barbs glinting in the bleak winter sun. Pressure. Held. The nettle stands guard, its sting a promise of what comes next. The image fails spectacularly only after it has been patient beyond reason. The scorpion grass does not move, its threat is constant. The nettle does not apologize for its burn. That's the thing about pressure, it doesn't leave until it's too late to save what it's consumed. The grass waits, the nettle spreads, the server hums, the star burns incorrectly for this weather. 12. Mediatrix, Redemptrix, Dominatrix. The hedges close in again. Between you and what you worship, I install latency, a buffering wheel of lace and chrome. Kneel if it steadies you, stand if it doesn't. Ivy scales slowly. It starts as surface detail but ends up rewriting structure over time until the original architecture is unrecognizable. Bindweed accelerates the process, faster, less elegance. Tightening, redirecting, pulling everything toward its own logic of proximity. The ivy chokes the oak. The bindweed strangles the cairn. I mediate by misalignment, redeem by refusing resolution, dominate by withholding immediacy. No permission, no let it go. Just enough friction to produce desire, just enough delay to produce devotion. 13. Temptress, dictatoress, cowardice. The path narrows into shadowed ground where light behaves as if partially refused. Belladonna holds its fruit like stored instruction, dark, lacquered, legible only at the edge of looking. Thornapple opens into spine geometry, each surface a decision against approach. Nothing here permits contact without consequence. Desire is not drawn toward objects, it is drawn into spacing. What you want remains slightly misaligned with what appears. That gap is the mechanism. I remain there, ruling by hesitation. 14. The solitary pursuit of infatuation. With its delicate blue flowers, the harebell trembles in the wind, ephemeral. Distance maintains divinity. Infatuation scales better than intimacy. The harebell bends as you approach, then rights itself when you pass. Across field, across hedge, across screen, longing preserves structure. The harebell does not promise forever. Get too near and worship collapses into habit. I remain just far enough to be myth. 15. I don't know how many hollow gestures I have left. Ruins ahead, and kneeling has worn grooves in stone. The kneeling grass bends under the weight of prayer, its blades flattened by repetition. The stone crop clings to the ruins, its fleshy leaves a testament to endurance. The same devotion repeated until language disperses. The kneeling grass does not rise again, the stone crop does not complain. I have performed apparitions so often that the outline remains after I step away. The grooves are deep now, the grass is worn thin. A system can continue on the strength of its own afterimage. The danger is that it no longer requires a body. Cloud cover interrupts the pattern before completion, but still the body is inferred. Still the believers connect one point to another. The stone crop spreads, silent and stubborn. I am considering stepping out of alignment. 16. The grey image has no form. Path disappears into mist, the haze swallows the path, erasing the line between earth and sky. The bog asphodel glows in the dark, a ghost light with no source, a beacon with no destination. The mist does not explain itself, the bog does not answer. In the space between things, emptiness suggests so much more than the visible ever could. The mist thickens, the asphodel fades. This is what the system cannot tolerate, formlessness. No edges to extract, no units to measure, no subject to own. Meaning without containment. 17. The grey image has no form, and neither do I. At the edge of the field there is no edge. I'm done rehearsing collapse for now. The shadow stretches long across the field, a presence without substance. I've become the absence, the non-object. The shadow shifts with the sun. The wind does not stop to listen. The landscape will continue to render around you.
Welcome back. That was Image Field. Really beautiful work, Bassam. Before we get into the landscape and the politics of the work, I wanted to start with the narrator. The landscape feels really full of human traces, but completely devoid of human life. So is this narrator someone walking through this place, or have they become a part of it? How do you see them as a body or an object?
Yeah, I think I really wanted the work to begin with the narrator seeming like just someone walking through the landscape, but over the course of the work, their position becomes increasingly unstable. I wasn't interested in creating a fixed character moving through a setting. I kind of wanted the voice to shift between observer, participant, and even like infrastructure, mythological figure, or even weather system. The landscape is full of human traces like roads, hedgerows, chapels, data centers, agricultural systems, but human bodies are largely absent because the work is interested in the structures that remain after people have passed through it. And I think the narrator occupies a certain position within those structures. Sometimes they seem to be walking the landscape, describing what they encounter, or at other times they appear to be speaking as the landscape itself or as the system operating within it. And I think as I was writing it, I wanted the identity of the narrator to behave similarly to the plants that appear in each section, something that spreads, mutates, or even like refuses containment. And that felt really important because one of the central concerns of this project, which me and Jennifer are developing, is how contemporary systems, whether technological, bureaucratic, or historical, depend on making things legible or classifiable. So the narrator resisting that process, they never give you that full resolve into like a singular subject. And the final section, when the text arrives at the great image has no form and neither do I, the voice has become almost inseparable from the environment. It moves through less like a person in a landscape than a consciousness circulating through a field of relations. So I think the absence of visible human life also allows other forms of agency to come forward, plants, weather, infrastructure, myth, and architecture all become active participants, the narrator is one voice among those forces rather than the central authority organizing them.
Part of my encounter with the work and thinking about that narrator being kind of devoid of a human perspective is also the wash of the different types of plant and life that exist in the bog. You know, there is, in the way that it's structured, is almost like a series of chapters and segments. It's kind of like both acknowledging classification while trying to reject it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you're giving us the names and the titles of these different types of plant life, but then it's dissolving into the technological, which I think is also when you're walking through a bog kind of in the flesh in a way. Like I listened to this almost like a guide through a bog landscape. That was my encounter with the work rather than this sort of sense of what exactly plant is this? I mean,
there's a practice of artists like doing art walks and like sound works for art walks. While you were making this work, did you consider that this could be an audio work for a walk? I know it's kind of a work in progress.
Yeah, I think like in my head, it's almost like a meditation. Because I think me and Jennifer always talk about like, I mean, there was a moment where I just listened to so many meditation podcasts. But sometimes we'll be in the car and we'd be like, oh my God, I hope nothing embarrassing is on. I'd be like, oh, maybe like a really terrible song. She'd be like, no, it'll be like, you know, because we both have this book called Meditations for Women Who Work Too Much, which I would recommend. That's got one meditation for each day.
I think I need that.
Yeah, it's like a really small book and you can just keep it in your bag and then like every day you open it and be like, care for yourself. And you're like, ah. In a lot of our films, the voice is really slowed down. So you really get this like cadence of just like something really slow and almost like slightly meditative, but also almost something like allows you to dissociate into where the work is leading imagery wise.
Yeah.
So it's like
lulling.
Yeah. So I think sometimes if you were to transport that into the real world, you wouldn't get that effect of it like blurring over you because you're in it.
Yeah.
So it's
and
like
you'd be distracted.
Yeah.
by
So
the
it's almost the transportation of audio or like video that allows you to like move from one place to another. And even like the soundtrack is like really pulled and really kind of eerie. Which was like very specific because I mean also part of this project we were doing a lot of research into like mythological figures, and in Ireland there's this like moments where you kind of realize like a lot of the time these like feminine female mythological figures exist on the periphery of stories. So like banshees existing on the periphery, they never appear in the open, they're always like peripheral. So there's something interesting about some things existing peripherally rather than like in.
Is the banshee something that you've like worked with a lot? Is that like a reoccurring motif?
No, I mean,
in
I
your
think
work?
one of the things, I think maybe now, because me and Jennifer have made a few works together, we've realized like a lot of the times it is just focuses on female mythological figures across like different ideas of mythology. So like I think the first film we made together was about a zombie. And we made the film during COVID, and there was this voiceover that talks about the Irish graveyard as like a garden. The next film was about goddesses, but again, they're kind of amalgamations of ideas of goddesses rather than a representation of a goddess. So I think even the reference of a banshee gets interesting to look at. But there's also a moment where you're like, now I just want to create a world with this information in mind rather than I'm gonna like take on this context of a banshee.
Yeah.
Do you know? Because I think sometimes like it's so loaded when you take on these things that have been like studied and talked about in so many ways. That it's kind of interesting to just think about them and how they exist in a culture, and then be able to kind of nitpick that and create like a version of it. But
or that feeling of it rather than the actual like the imagery of it.
And like not necessarily just take that vessel, but to take like the contents of the vessel and just put them in something else.
Talking about bogs, this brings us to the second question pretty seamlessly. So bogs are one of the oldest natural archives that we have. They preserve bodies, objects, and organic matter for millennia, holding things intact against time in the same wet Irish climate that now cools server racks. How do you see the bog and the data farm as doing the same thing, or is the bog in this work offering a different kind of memory, one that is accidental, collective, and without ownership?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see them as doing the same thing, even though like maybe in the beginning of writing this, the comparison was like tempting, because both are like forms of storage operating within the same landscape. And I guess what interested me was the strange proximity between these two archives. And the bog preserves through saturation, slowness, and accident. It doesn't decide what is important between bodies, pollen, seeds, tools. Everything becomes folded together into a kind of collective memory without a clear author or owner. Things survive because conditions allowed them to survive, not because they were selected for preservation, whereas like a data center operates very differently. It's highly managed, and it's built around extraction, classification, retrieval, and ownership. Information is constantly being organized, indexed, and made available for future use. Its memory is instrumental, while the bog's memory is indifferent. And I think in this, when I was writing this, I was interested in how these two forms of storage sit alongside one another in contemporary Ireland. Like the same damp climate that has preserved organic matter for thousands of years is now marketed as an efficient cooling system for digital infrastructure. There's like a strange continuity, but also a profound difference in what is being preserved and for whom. In a way, the bog becomes important because it offers an alternative model of memory, something that's fragmented, collective, and often illegible. That's very close to the project's broader interest in opacity, and like through the work I'm thinking about what happens when things refuse perfect legibility. The bog doesn't function like a database where information can simply be retrieved on demand. It stores traces rather than answers, and it preserves relationships, atmosphere, and residues rather than clean records. So if the data farm represents a contemporary desire for complete storage and total accessibility, the bog represents another possibility, one about memory without ownership, preservation without extraction, and a form of knowledge that remains partial no matter how closely you examine it.
By the end of next year, data centers will take up 30% of all Irish electrical production. 30% of the grid is going on data centers because of this marketing ploy of like, oh, it's a colder climate, it's easier to cool down. And I say this because I think there's something about this kind of construction of data centers that's also, there's kind of two sides to this. One of it, it's a globalized thing, which is sort of, to me, is interesting in the Irish context because that globalization has led to mostly kind of megacorps like Google, Microsoft, etc., having cheap corporate tax, so they'll kind of place their offices in the country. And so it's like this kind of small peripheral nation, but now very wealthy nation, supplying this data center, data server production for kind of, I'm assuming, majority of other parts of Europe. And then the other side of it with the bog, and thinking about the bog for me was like the urban versus the rural, which is also kind of the data center thing, is like this supposedly like empty land, like the bog is kind of sold as like empty land. I was wondering when you were also thinking about the construction of this work, because the work itself doesn't feel like it's a series of contrasts. You know, it's about kind of trying to draw in these ideas around, let's say, ecology and technology and mythology that are usually kind of held quite separately from one another and allowing them to coexist. Was there also a thought around those types of contrasts in terms of who is it for? You know, as you're talking about like ownership, you know, like the bog doesn't belong. I mean, there was a period of time when it belonged to the state, but the Irish state. But was there a sense of that contrast of kind of who is this for?
The reason why I'm so interested in bogs is because they've constantly been reimagined according to the needs of different economic or political systems. So like historically, it was often understood as a wasteland, something to be drained, cut, improved, or made productive. Then it became a site of industrial extraction through peat harvesting. And now recently it's been reframed through carbon accounting, conservation, biodiversity markets, and discussions around digital infrastructure. The bog seems to repeatedly become valuable according to whatever logic of management is dominant at a given time. And I think what interested me is that despite all of these attempts, the bog never entirely cooperates. It's a landscape that exceeds the categorization imposed upon it. It stores carbon, preserves archaeological remains, supports ecosystems, carries cultural memory, and resists easy development at all the same time. And it remains so stubborn. And I think the relationship between rural and urban spaces is really important here. We often imagine bogs as remote or peripheral places, but they've always been deeply connected to wider systems, peat-heated homes and powered industries. And today's questions around carbon storage, environmental policy, or like energy infrastructure connect these landscapes to a global network of capital and information. What appears peripheral is often central to how these systems function. So that relationship between center and periphery runs throughout this work. And Ireland often occupies a similar position within larger technological and economical networks. It's presented as a gateway, a host, and a site of storage or processing, while the benefits and costs of those systems are unevenly distributed. One of the things we're exploring through the Rococo research of this project is how Ireland has repeatedly occupied this contradictory position, appearing central within larger networks while remaining structurally precarious. More personally, I'm interested in bogs because they challenge the way we imagine place itself. They're difficult landscapes to navigate, map, or stabilize, and they don't conform easily to visual logics of roads, or property lines or agricultural productivity, and they're constantly shifting between land and water and surface and depth or visibility and concealment.
I mean, I think this kind of points to a much broader, maybe longer standing history of land always being sort of valued under the demands of capital, whether that capital is technological, whether that's infrastructural, whether that's industrial, and, you know, right back to serfdom and kind of feudalism, right? What I think is interesting about the bog here is that I didn't know this, but it doesn't contain oxygen.
Yeah.
Like,
that's why it can preserve, and is that why it can preserve?
Yeah.
Okay.
And bog butter, that's literally people keeping things in a bog to preserve them because there's no oxygen. Maybe there's an interest in this as well, because the bog is kind of, it forms part of Irish folklore, right? There's this idea of the will-o'-the-wisp, which are these faint flickering lights that kind of appear over bogs, and people were thinking that they were spirits leading travellers astray. So they also operate under this kind of like horror lens as well.
So moving on to the next question. When we invited you on the show, you mentioned that you were looking at how Rococo architecture in Ireland was itself an imported style that became something distinctly local, and how scholars have argued that Ireland actually exported it back outward, reversing the usual colonial flow. Do you see the plants in this work doing something similar, as life that refuses the systems laid over them and maybe even corrupts those systems from within?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really fascinated me about like Rococo in an Irish context was that it complicates the idea of cultural influence moving in one direction. So although Rococo arrived through like a broader European network, and scholars have argued that Irish plaster workers developed an insular variation that became influential beyond Ireland itself. So rather than simply receiving a style, local makers transformed it, quote unquote, misused it and sent it back out again in altered form. I'm interested in the plants and the work in a similar way, and they're not passive elements of the landscape. They don't simply exist within a system of classification, agriculture, property, or infrastructure. They constantly exceed them. Hedgerows break roads, roots split concrete, invasive species ignore borders, and weeds appear in places they weren't meant to grow. They operate according to their own temporalities and logics. So throughout the text, the plants function almost like liches within a larger system of organization. And the foxglove is described as a rendering error, or the donkey thorn becomes a warning sign. Bog cotton becomes unstable ground. Again and again, plants interrupt smooth navigation, visibility, or categorization. They expose the limits of systems that imagine themselves to be complete. And I think what interested me in that is that they don't necessarily resist from the outside. They often work from within systems, in the way that like bindweed uses the host system's architecture to spread itself further. That's a very different from an image of a heroic opposition, and it's slower, more parasitic, more transformative. In that sense, there's a connection to Rococo. Historically, ornament is often dismissed as superficial or secondary, but Rococo decoration could become so excessive that it destabilized the structure it was supposed to be serving. The plants in the work do something similar in that they begin as botanical detail but gradually become alternative forms of intelligence. They take the infrastructure built around them, whether that's roads, hedges, farms, data centers, archives, and redirect them towards other end. I think that's really the political gesture running through the work. I'm less interested in clean acts of resistance than in forms of corruption, mutation, and misalignment.
When we were talking about bog as an archive and like how it doesn't select anything, it's just whatever happens. It was just making me think, like, what if these data farms ended up being the thing that ended up being archived, and it's not necessarily the what if it kind of suddenly there ended up being this kind of like weird flow of like actually the thing that is meant to kind of collectively store information becomes the thing that's stored, but the information itself will never be stored because it's not.
Kind of
like,
makes me think of your work, in fact. Like, if you kind of like the way yours was like a fiction about if you encountered this archive, like how would you imagine it? But like, what if you found a data center in a bog?
Yeah, like what story would that tell?
Like what would that tell you about the world?
And you had no way of like actually getting the information out of it. Like what would these sort of like weird? I want to say monolithic, but they're not monolithic. But like, what would these sort of weird kind of hardware structures? Like, I mean, maybe
they'd be like pyramids or something.
Exactly.
You know, they'd just be these kind of like relics that nobody understands, and they'd be like data centerology.
Yeah,
like, you know,
it would just be like, what is this? Like, what is
and
this?
then like young weird kids, like you had to, you know, I feel like now it's like you're obsessed with Egypt or mythology, and then you'd have like a third like data centerology, you know, just like an unexplainable
Yeah, well, would they even think it's data? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
would-
it could
would-
just be
would-
like
would
sculptural
people even
almost.
Think that, like, yeah, would people even think that there was actually information being stored in here, or would they think that it's like? Could people suddenly be like, "Oh, these are just big batteries"? Like,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
they could
yeah,
think that it's completely...
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, because I'm thinking about like the Flash player and how that's just like no longer, like, if we encounter these things 100 years from now, we won't maybe have the technology to actually get into them. And it reminds me of like this theory that we've maybe already encountered aliens, we just don't have the technology to understand that yet, which is maybe a bit conspiracy theory led, but like just this idea that like we only have one kind of knowledge, or we don't have a knowledge, like all knowledge of the entire universe, so we can't know everything.
Yeah, and I think maybe bringing that back into like what you're talking about with like Rococo, I guess, like when you were talking, I had this visual in my head of these sort of plants creeping up like the data centers, and how would they somehow play a part in kind of preserving these structures.
Like around where I live, there's like I think like a derelict car dealership, but the entire building is like overgrown with buddleias.
Right, okay.
And it's like the whole thing kind of like is so beautiful in the summer because you just get this like sea of purple. But other than that, it's like the whole building is getting like destroyed by these like I don't know if buddleias are classified as invasive in Ireland, but they definitely do take over. And it's like because the only thing in that space is concrete. They're the only thing that's able to like crack the road.
Yeah.
But then the other things are like growing within them. So there is something interesting about like maybe plants destroying data, like, you know, at a time after us. Yeah. All of these things will just become like rubble. Yeah, like inevitably.
Like, will there be like a certain kind of plant species that totally flourishes inside the servers?
Well, I mean, I remember having conversations with some architects before about using Japanese knotweed as a way to destroy concrete foundations, in terms of it will literally grow through concrete, but thinking about what are ways that are more ecologically sensitive, because obviously it's incredibly energy intensive to destroy a concrete foundation. I guess my question about the Rococo thing is also about how like the interior of Rococo structures also itself sort of archives maybe the desire of like what type of plant life is valued, and like are there ways in which like the architecture of the data center or the data servers themselves like also like reflects or denies that, like when, you know, as soon as it's not attached to the grid, like what do they become? Like without an electrical source, you're just left with this kind of monument to something that is no longer important.
I think maybe one of the things that's also really interesting is that there's a lot of data centers on like the west of Ireland, and I think the west of Ireland has like a very specific image of Ireland, which is Ireland almost as like the butter ad Ireland, which is like hilly, grassy. There's cows on the hills, so it's really interesting when you see that like you can drive and it looks so idyllic and it really looks like a butter ad. Then all of a sudden you see this just block that does look just like superimposed onto this landscape. So it's almost like it does feel like quite alien when you see that,
like the monolith and
or just like how. And I think there's parts
it doesn't fit
yeah,
in.
or like, you know, when you're in Donegal or Kerry, you really feel how ancient a landscape Ireland is because the mountains are so undulating, they're not sharp, and you really feel just like how old it is. And then it's like really strange to see these like very sharp edges in a landscape that is actually quite soft.
Yeah, even like when you just mentioned the pyramid, for me, looking at a pyramid in a desert is like the image that it doesn't seem weird, and I wonder whether like this is where we're heading, where like rolly, hilly fields, like it will eventually become, maybe not for us, but maybe for future generations.
I mean, there is
will
like
become like
when you see these fields covered in solar panels, it is like very shocking when you see it. And I'm not super familiar with the politics of that, but as in like, as in it is very like bizarre when you see it, just like this like sea of reflective
panels.
And it's like dead underneath, so it's like no longer even serving like any ecological.
So it's almost like urban life is allowed to continue relatively uninterrupted
or unquestioned, you know, that like.
I want to draw out the relationship a little bit more between older systems of organising land or belief and perception and the contemporary computational infrastructures that are running through the work. Throughout the text, we hear about these hedgerows, bogs and agricultural boundaries that appear alongside data centres, servers and algorithmic systems. these older forms of organising knowledge and movement, I think I see them as proto-technologies. I'm thinking here about Eric Davis's Technosis and how it traces a tendency within digital culture to imagine information as immaterial or transcendent. But your work repeatedly brings us back to soil, heat, toxicity, and these ecological systems. Is this a way of maybe rematerializing the digital? And I'm thinking also in your work, there's a really beautiful image. When I read the bit, or when I listened to the bit, they paved the lane last summer so the servers could arrive without mud on their tires. Like this very kind of contradictory thing between the shiny data center and like the dirty nature.
Yeah, I think it feels so constant that digital culture produces these fantasies of transcendence or immateriality or even like frictionless communication. And I think they all feel like these ideas aren't like escape from the body, and this idea that information appears to float free from the material world. But I think what is really interesting is that the reality is that these digital systems are so profoundly material. They require land, mineral, energy, water, labor, logistics, and maintenance. They produce heat and they occupy territory. They reshape landscapes. And I think maybe that line that you just mentioned is trying to collapse that distance between what is supposedly virtual and the stubbornly physical. And I think I was interested in the fact that even the most advanced computational systems remain dependent on very ordinary material conditions. Like roads have to be built, fields have to be cleared, electricity has to be moved through cables, cooling systems have to function. And throughout the work, plants, mud, bog water, toxins, weather systems, and like bodily fluids continually interrupt the fantasy of digital abstraction. They remind us that information never escapes matter. It simply passes through different material arrangements. That's also why the landscape is so important. Like the West of Ireland often appears in promotional narratives around data infrastructure as a kind of empty space, a cool climate, or like a useful geographical condition. But landscapes are never empty. They're full of histories, ecologies, memories, and competing life forms. The work tries to keep these things present rather than allowing the landscape to become a neutral backdrop. In a way, the plants are doing a similar job. They keep dragging the work back into embodiment. Every plant in the text has a specific physical reality. They insist on remaining material actors within the world. So I think for me, I think the project is partly about rematerializing the digital, not to demystify it completely because I'm still interested in myth, fantasy, and desire, but to show that even our most abstract systems remain entangled with soil, climate, infrastructure, bodies, and forms of extraction. And the spiritual and the material aren't opposites in the work, they're constantly contaminating one another. And I think what's interesting is that digital infrastructures also present themselves as like radically new. Like that's the image they try to build, but actually they're based on these like quite old technology. Like there's a lineage of these things and they're connected to these lineages, but there's almost like they try to paint this like break between before and after.
As in the before and after the installation of these technologies,
of this stuff,
or
like I think tech as a kind of genre of stuff that seems to be occurring in our world more often. Even like now AI very specifically, there's like a pre and post, but actually there is like a line of stuff that has had to happen for this is just an extension of it. It's happening very quickly. But as in, like, these stuff have existed for a long time.
Yeah.
Like, the idea in video games, everyone talks about the AI of, like, your opponent and how bad or good they are. So artificial intelligence and how to, like, interact with stuff has existed. And people have been building these models of, like, creating images for a long time. It's just, it's never been this sophisticated or this accessible.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking even, like, Kate Crawford, Joel Voller work.
The map of AI.
Yeah, like tracing these technologies, but kind of back from the 1600s through to the present. And like, as you're saying, kind of documenting that lineage through time. I think also in terms of, I guess, because there's a sense of like, there's the before and the after. And I think particularly in the west of Ireland, there's that image of how it's promoted via tourism, where it's empty space, but also it's untouched space, like particularly places like the Burren, which is classified as a desert, and also it's like really interesting in terms of plant life because loads of plants like don't exist because the climate is so unique there, only exists there. But thinking more so about the idea of that sense of the untouched, you know, and also like when the data center arrives as this kind of sleek contemporary box shape in this undulating landscape, it like appears like as a simulation in the landscape. It appears unreal. Like the closest thing I can think of to it is there's Mudshoot Farms in London, which is in kind of southeast London, close to Greenwich. But when you go there, you can see kind of fields with sheep. But in the background, you have Canary Wharf. You have the skyscrapers of Canary Wharf. And it's such an odd contrast between the two. And that's sort of what like the data center in this rural context is doing as well. It's like taking the urban, taking the technological, placing it into an environment where you wouldn't
But I think it feels so out of place that your mind doesn't even contextualize it very quickly, that it does look superimposed. And I think maybe decidedly so. Like it doesn't look like a factory. It's not like producing smoke that you can see. And therefore it does just look like a break in like a render or something.
Yeah.
Do you know, like it looks so out of place in these things. And I think maybe that's part of their design. I don't like, you know, it's like it's such a strange thing to look at. Even when we looked up a lot of I mean, I've been doing a lot of like image research on these things, and none of the images look real.
Right. Yeah.
They've started because there's now specific firms in Ireland that are designing the data centers, and now because they've done so many of them, they're actually becoming experts and it's being exported out to other parts of the world.
But there is a movement against this, like the perma-computing movement and things like this, where people are actually salvaging e-waste, essentially to stop computing being associated with these like shiny black boxes. And it's more like DIY, hacky kind of assemblages of processing and
Okay, so just to finish up with our last question, as this mini-series is responding to the theme of folkloric sculpture for the digital age, I was thinking about sculpture and how it is traditionally about fixing form, giving something permanent, touchable presence. This work seems to resist that completely. The great image has no form, the narrator has no form, and yet the piece keeps circling back to that phrase, the great image has no form, as if this formlessness is itself a kind of arrival rather than an absence. Is that a conversation with sculpture or a refusal of it? And can something that actively resists forming ever really function as an image?
I don't necessarily think it's a refusal of sculpture so much as an attempt to think about sculpture differently. Like maybe traditionally sculpture is often understood through permanence, solidity, and the idea of like fixing a form. But I'm also interested in sculpture as something that records instability, pressure, erosion, or transformation. Because even the most solid object is really a temporary arrangement of materials passing through time. So I think the phrase, the great image has no forms, comes partly from a fascination with traditions of thought where the highest or most significant image is precisely the one that can't be represented. The idea felt useful when thinking about contemporary image culture, which is increasingly organized around visibility, recognition, or extraction. And I think throughout the work, the images keep failing to stabilize. The narrator shifts identity, the landscape dissolves into mist, plants move between symbol and material realities. And the entire walk that's the sound work is based on the points of the constellation of the Scorpius structure. But from Ireland, it never fully appears above the horizon. So everything remains partial and their work keeps approaching form, but never quite settling into it. And for me, that's not necessarily an absence. It's actually a productive condition. Formlessness isn't the opposite of form. It's what keeps form open. It's what prevents an image from becoming fixed, exhausted. Once something becomes completely legible, it can be classified, indexed, or instrumentalized. And the work is interested in preserving a degree of excess that escapes those processes. And I think that's also why Rococo became important to the project, because Rococo ornament often operates at the threshold between form and dissolution. Surfaces fold into one another, figures emerge and disappear, boundaries become unstable. You never encounter a perfectly resolved image. You're constantly moving through layers of distraction, interruption, or excess. And I think the great image in the final text isn't a final picture waiting to be revealed. It's more like a field, a way of navigating uncertainty without reducing it to a single form. And by the end, when the narrator said that the great image has no form and neither do I, it's less a disappearance than a release from the obligation to be fully visible or fully coherent.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, is an image actually ever fully formed? Like, especially digital imagery that moves through different people passing it on, like it loses it's lossy. It's a
kind
lossy
of,
image.
I think what is interesting, I mean, it's so interesting, like living through a cycle of the internet. And like also now when you see old memes that were being spread on like Tumblr, being spread on like Instagram now, but they've been passed through so many filters that they're like a different thing. And it's funny when like, I know they're all saying like when something is on the internet, it never disappears. And now, like having been on the internet for so long, ever since I was like 9, things do disappear. Things that you used to like watch as like kids, like these like vines and like memes, have completely disappeared from like, if you try to look for them, they're actually quite difficult to find, even if they were at a certain point quite popular.
No, I find that on TikTok. Like if I don't like something,
it's just gone.
Yeah.
And you can never find it because also like it's not like there's a search engine that you can like search very specifically. And I think maybe that's also the interest in that there's such a sea of images, but none of them feel like solid. Like everything feels like it's just like slipping in and out of like consciousness. And I think specifically with Instagram, and I think especially with being an artist who makes images, the difficulty is then like having to engage with that way of like
solidifying.
But also like making digital images also then more difficultly because they can navigate that system so easily. And I think there's maybe occasionally the impulse to keep posting work, and I think as of like the last 5 years, there part of me has like withdrawn a little bit from doing that because I don't necessarily know if it's like that useful.
What, to be visible?
To be that visible. I think there's a degree of mystery that is actually quite important as a person, but also in terms of like creating work, because actually
you disappear.
You also, but also like the mystery of art is kind of so interesting when you go to a show and you don't know what you're going to see. And this was like so interesting because like this Venice Biennial was the first time I'd been to Venice, but also it was the first time I'd been to Venice at its opening.
Okay.
But usually you feel like you've seen it anyway because everybody you know posts at the same time and they all do their like carousel of like their 10 best pavilions.
Yeah.
And actually being there while that was happening was like bizarre.
I think I got this from your show at Fact, Bassam, because I didn't really read about that before going to see it, or I didn't see any images of it. And I think what the images do is they flatten kind of like affect and an emotional experience with the work, and which I found with your show, just being in amongst these huge sculptures. Like an image cannot do that justice.
Yeah.
Well, I think also it's like, especially when we're talking about sculpture, like one of the things I always think about with sculpture is space, is building, is room, in terms of where, like if you are making physical sculpture, it's like how are you also curating that space in terms of the person's approach towards and things like this. And all of those are so individual. You know, the image, as you're saying, Rebecca, it flattens, it forces one perspective, whether as part of the reason why you're making something in 3D, whether that be as physical or as digital, is the fact that you can move around it in the 360.
Yeah.
You know, that's a very,
multiple perspectives of an object or of something.
It's multiple perspectives, but it's also like my height will affect how I view it.
Yeah.
You know, the body that I'm in will affect how I view it. And that's such an important thing to be able to hold onto in terms of as an artist and like how you're creating that affect.
Yeah. I think maybe that's also what is so interesting about creating objects while also creating these like CGI films. I mean, one of the things is like I produce the CGI films myself, so I'm doing the animation, and like part of me is like very proud of how like glossy and slick they've become. But there's also like I'm also aware that there's a trap in that how glossy you can make something. And I think there's something interesting about making objects, specifically the objects that were in fact, which were all made of polystyrene, which is that they all got scuffed within like 10 minutes. Like you don't really have a control. And I'm not a particularly tidy person, so I mean I told all the technicians like it doesn't really matter if you wear gloves or not because I'm gonna have to paint them anyway. Like they're gonna touch the floor, they're gonna touch a piece of wood, they're gonna get scuffed. But there's almost that moment and the polystyrene sculptures are CNC'd from digital files, so there's almost that moment when these like digital objects get made into like the physical world, they're always gonna collapse under the weight of like gravity, or like just the weight of just like existing in the world.
Okay, I think we're gonna have to end there. Thank you so much for coming on the show, agreeing to do this, and also for making the trip down to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're really honored.
And sharing such a beautiful work with us, allowing us to premiere this new sound piece as well. Yeah,
and I guess it is a work in progress, so do let us know like how this work and this idea develops so that we can share it for any of the listeners that have really enjoyed this work.
Thank you so much, Bassam.
Thank you.
Great.
And we'll see you real soon.
Yes. And thank you. And as this is the last episode, thank you to the Henry Moore Institute for inviting us to do this program. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.